And there we are. Welcome to today. Hello, my name is Brendan McCarran, and welcome to our webinar today, Commercial Financial Mindset. And sitting on my left is my colleague Sean Nolan. Sean, do you want to just introduce yourself and to everybody?
Hello, everybody. So Sean Nolan, Director of Local Government and Policing with CIFA. So behind that is about 16 years as a County Treasurer and 4 years as a Treasurer in the police setting, and a number of national roles, but now being with CIFA about a year, and particularly involved in this agenda, if you like, but particularly involved in looking to support treasurers and senior finance practitioners.
So, sorry, I'm just being asked to expand the screen. So, oops, we've lost our camera. So, what you should be able to see is, there we are. All right, I'm back on screen. People can see you. There we are. We can see it. And I'm Brendan McCarran, and my job is to, as CIFA Leadership Development Lead, is to look at the way in which we work with CFOs and others on what broadly described as a leadership agenda, but increasingly that is including commercialism, so hence we're here. If I can go through a few of the administrative issues for the moment, can you show us that you can hear us by raising your hand on the screen? There should be a green or a yellow button for you to do so, so that you can hear. If you have any difficulties, then we have Sev, one of my colleagues, is here, and she will help you through any technical questions. So if you've got any technical questions, type them in. If you have any questions in general, please use the chat box. At the end of the discussion, what we'll do is we'll go through and look at all your questions and try and address those questions at the end. If you've got something really exciting, then maybe we'll stop and we'll look at your question. And I think that's all our admin. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to take the camera off, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by looking at some of the key questions that we've asked, the poll questions, which is just turning everything off now. Sorry about the admin. We're going to look at what we described as poll questions, and you may have come across these. So you should be able to see these questions, and I'm going to just launch. The first question this is just to get a straw poll, if you like, of what you think. The poll is open, and what it's asking is, first of all, do you have a standard definition of what it is to be commercial or what commercialism means? So if you can just give us a feel for that. And it's at the moment it's 40%-ish yes and 60% no. So we're just looking at how that's going. If you just, I think the voting is pretty much over. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close the poll and then show you the answer. Well, the answer is 26% say yes, there's a consistent definition, and 74% say no. So I think I can show you that. No, maybe not. Anyway, take my word for it. It's 26. Yeah, 26% say yes, and 74% saying no. So there we are. I think that's the answer to that one. Let's look at the second question. How prepared do you believe your organisation is as a whole for a more commercial approach? 1 to 5. Where 5 is well prepared. So 5 is the top answer you can get. So I'm just going to launch that for you now. And 0 or 1 is we're not really prepared at all. So just give us a flavour for that. We'll just get a flavour for what we think. And it's very much sitting on the fence there. It looks like neither prepared or not prepared is going to come top. I think everybody has pretty much voted now. It hasn't changed. 96% of you have voted. So I'm going to close that, and I'm just going to share it with you so you can see the results yourselves. And there is actually 28 and 4%. What's that? 32%. So a third of you saying we're not really prepared at all. Scoring 1 and 2. And then 5 and 4, so what's that, 12 and 16% in all saying, well, we are well prepared or nearly well prepared. So it's quite an interesting, maybe 2 to 1 less prepared to prepared there. So I'm just going to go for our third question now. And our third question is, okay, that was the second question was about the organisation as a whole. What we're going to ask you now is what we're much more interested in, which is about finance. And again, the same kind of scoring. So how do you believe the degree to which you think finance is ahead of the game, is ready for this agenda? Bearing in mind the last question was about a third thought they were unprepared as an organisation. Okay, nearly everybody's voted there. One person obviously still making up their mind. So I'm going to close that and let's just see what the scores are. So if I show that again so you can see what the scores were. So 29% and 4%, so 33%, again about a third saying not really prepared at all, and only about half that, a few more perhaps, but still just over half actually well prepared for it. So another interesting interesting result. So obviously there's some work to do, and hopefully by the time we finish today, you'll have some thoughts about how to take the agenda forward, how to start developing a mindset if you haven't already done so. So this is a discussion about, as it says, defining commercialization, governance, strategy making, particularly around risk, and the main issue around due diligence, really, and risk. So those are the sort of general areas we're going to be talking about, but actually it's more about a discussion between Sean and I around these issues. So we're not necessarily going to stick to the agenda. We may be going a bit off piece at times. So let's start us off. I suppose the first question, and I want to sort of start bringing Sean in here, is defining commercialism. You've got 3 questions on the screen there, and I think let's start with the first one, the obvious one. Is there a definition? Is there one definition, Sean?
In short, no. I hear the word, and I'm sure listeners hear the word used in lots of different contexts. I think it's in many ways it's a kind of a continuum. At one end, commercialism is describing kind of behaviours and skills. By that I mean, approaches to being business-like, or approaches to procurement, or approaches to contract management. All very important, equally valid. But increasingly, commercialism is being defined as actually the process of taking commercial risk rather than behaving commercially. So commercial risk clearly extends to examples we may come on to later, Brendan, but the idea of buying property, for example. Yeah. So not a standard definition. A lot depends on context. I think we're going to probably spend most of our time in this next hour or so, aren't we, talking more about, if you like, the commercial risk bit of commercialization rather than other bits of commercialization.
Because you've alluded there to the fact that there's a range, but I suppose that you and I have talked in the past about the fact that a lot of people think they are very commercial, so they have a very narrow definition maybe, and what we're talking about now is maybe people are expanding their definition.
Correct. So, but I would emphasise that the behaving commercially in the sense of business-like way of doing business, and appropriate approaches to contract management and procurement. Actually, that's still valid. I don't want to trivialise that, but I guess we're talking about the broader kind of interest in this area is in this taking on commercial risk.
So in a sense, actually, that sort of answers the question. The second question, how useful it is to define what it is we're talking about here. So not just what we're talking about, but within the organisation to have a clear definition. Do you agree that you need a clear definition?
I think the answer is yes. I think if we just reflect on the last 30 seconds. I think the worst thing to do is just have the word commercialisation and assume everyone has the same meaning attached to it. I think everyone should probably spend a bit of time explaining what they mean by commercialisation, because as they just reflected, actually people can mean genuinely, legitimately quite different things.
Yeah, and that means that, you know, that addresses that third question there. What's it for? It's to communicate exactly what you're trying to achieve here in your organisation. So definitions of commercialism. So we're starting off with a bit of ambiguity, and no doubt we're going to end up throughout this discussion areas of ambiguity. If we move on now to the sort of context and impetus. I mean, I suppose that this is about why are we sitting here now talking about this? Because we hear, I put up some quotations that sweating all assets and leveraging a balance sheet. These are sort of easy cliches that you hear in every presentation at the moment about this. But what does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, funny enough, Brendan, it's the following two bullet points I guess I would focus on. So I think there are kind of two big drivers. But let me just, before I delve into that, let me just say this isn't new. So local government have been involved in being more commercial, and by that I mean taking on a commercial risk for a long time. You know, we go back to our municipal forefathers; they took an awful lot of commercial risk to get things built and done. So I'm not suggesting this is new; it isn't. But what is new is the extent of the intensity. And the extent of exposure and the extent of kind of coverage that this is now attracting. I think there are two drivers to that, right, which is the third bullet point on your slide. We are living in times of austerity.
Yeah.
And linked to that are constant messages from the government about self-sufficiency in local income, about self-sufficiency in business rates, which is part of the 100% retention agenda. But all that is playing into not just self-sufficiency is good, but it's playing into the reality of austerity. Yeah. So there's a real driver around partly self-sufficiency, but partly about are there ways of securing other income, other offsetting opportunities to avoid the more difficult cuts that may otherwise be required. So that's one really big driver out there, which clearly, you know, austerity has been with us, if I can use that shorthand, since 2010. It ain't unfortunately going to finish in 2020. It's going to go on for a long time. So that driver of additional income, alternative sources, feeds and fuels this kind of greater impetus around commercial. The other big driver, however, is a can I say slightly more positive, and that's the fourth bullet point on your slide, which is a bit of jargon, but it's sometimes referred to as place shaping, or the council as a social entrepreneur. And what that really means is increasingly councils, and you see it everywhere, and it's great, but increasingly councils having the confidence and feeling the responsibility to kind of intervene in whatever way they can to help the local economy. So economic regeneration really falls into that agenda, but also, if you like, to be brokering networks, etc., to make it a more economic and a better place to live. So that is a positive agenda, but that is also driving the commercial. So two big drivers, austerity, self-sufficiency because of the response to falling grants, but also the kind of wish and desire for the council itself to feel like it's creating a better local environment, often economic development, but other agendas as well. They feel commercial,
and that's why here, why now, why we're focusing on this. Now this brings this interesting point we've got up here, which is about uneven skills gradients. And what do we mean by uneven skills gradients in this context?
Well, it's funny. So I get the opportunity to talk to quite a few treasurer societies, quite a few treasurers, and I've also been a treasurer, and I don't mind admitting what I'm about to say is as much about me as it is about anybody else. But we've just seen the poll results, which clearly we couldn't have anticipated. And actually what people are saying to us is they don't feel comfortable. And that is true for a number of reasons across the country. Now, back to the point I made earlier, this is not new, so there's lots of people who feel very comfortable and have been doing this for a long time. But actually, just historically, some environments have been less exposed to this agenda than others. So, I spent a lot of time in the county world. I don't want to offend any of my, erstwhile ex-county treasurer colleagues, but actually, I would kind of observe that, much of the district councils within county areas, their kind of senior finance staff were more exposed to commercial activities because of market town developments and the like than most of their county colleagues would have been. So there's an uneven gradient. Even within kind of districts, actually, you got people who have been there, older hands, with newer treasurers and senior staff who just don't feel as comfortable because they haven't had that experience. So it is an uneven skill gradient, which I think the poll has kind of suggested.
So one of the reasons for us thinking about this and SIP for taking a real look at this is because not only is we've got the pressures to do this, but also there's a feeling that we've got to make sure the skills are, the gradient is less sharp perhaps, and it's spread around, the knowledge is spread around. Which leads into this there's a very bold point in this slide, which is one of your favourite words at the moment, which is savviness. Now, what do you mean by this?
So basically, what I'm trying to get across, and it's a mantra that works for me, and I certainly find myself repeating it a lot. So I'm basically saying for the drivers I've talked about, financial balance and place shaping, actually, yes, you should be more commercial. You should split all your assets. You should leverage your balance sheet. But, and here's the key bit, the more commercial you are, particularly where that commercial is about taking on commercial risk, the more commercial you are, the more savvy your due diligence needs to be. You can't, just with all due respect to everyone, but you can't just apply old learning to a new circumstance. And if the new circumstance is something you've never done before or something the council hasn't done before, then you need to, and it involves commercial risk, more commercial risk than you've taken before, then actually that requires you to actually up the sophistication of your due diligence. And that's what I mean by the more commercial you are, and you should be, but the more savvy your due diligence needs to be. And that for me is kind of a dominant theme.
Yeah, and I think that you're picking up this idea that savviness is not necessarily about more of it. So it's not necessarily more in volume and more in depth of due diligence or more in weight of due diligence. It's just smarter and better due diligence.
Yes, but appropriate to the commercial risk you're taking. That's the key bit, and I'm sure we'll expand on that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to what I suppose is some of the answers to the question about how you define commercialism and commerciality. So being more commercial is about some of the things we've got here. Now, Sean, risk savviness again comes at the top there. So let's carry that through and tell us what you think about risk savviness.
Okay. So just for everyone listening, this is back to that piece of the kind of definition where you're about taking on more commercial risk rather than improving your contract management and the like. So that's particularly what I mean about if you take on more commercial risk, you need to be more savvy. So what do I mean? Well, if you take on more commercial risk, let's take the first word, risk. Actually, what's really, really important is that you feel, as a senior finance person, the CFO or a senior practitioner placed in that position, actually you feel you can understand what the downside risk is rather than just what everyone's telling you is the upside risk. Can you quantify it despite all the uncertainties? Point one, so that's at heart of risk savvy. The other bit of risk savvy is kind of actually feeds, funny enough, Brendan, into some of those other points. But it's about, okay, so what would be the right kind of skills I would need to appraise this?
Yeah.
Are they in-house? Are they not in-house? Actually, what I would say to anyone, it's actually about almost being prepared to be honest with yourself and colleagues about what you don't know is a key bit about being savvy, because that opens up the opportunity to think about where I need to go elsewhere. But also, we can maybe expand on some of those points later, but if you look at some of those other bullet points on that slide, so it's about understanding risk. It's about actually having the right skills to appraise and manage the risk. And clearly, as you're into a new commercial venture, new things which involve risk, commercial risk, can you quantify the downside? Do people understand it? Actually, the third bullet point is really important there, thinking and behaviours. Because of the two drivers I talked about before, Those two drivers being austerity, self-sufficiency on the funding side, but also place shaping, economic development, social entrepreneur. These are very positive reasons to be more commercial. So the CFO, the treasurer, senior staff, actually you want the organisation to feel you're leaning into that.
Yeah.
You're positively trying to make that happen. So that actually does put some responsibility on you as a senior finance staff to actually make the finance systems work in a way that supports that.
Yeah.
But it's also about, in a sense, how you also put yourself in a position, as those decisions have been taken, to put yourself in the best position to be talking about, risk savviness and talk about due diligence in a way that people think, this is helpful and necessary, rather than getting in the way.
So one of the things that I think that people have a natural tendency to do is when faced with more risk or faced with uncertainty is to actually put more controls in place.
Yeah.
And to strengthen their existing controls. And I think it's an interesting thing that you're talking about here about leading in and encouraging other colleagues to behave. So it's not just about your own behaviours as a CFO, but it's about your colleagues' behaviour around that senior leadership team. But also you can fall foul of having a particular behaviour, which is very positive, but actually how that is enacted on the ground. It might be that you produce a massive checklist or a massive business case approach. You have to be careful of that, don't you?
You do, and funny enough, the example you've kind of were quoting there is it's a really good example because I've seen it before, and I think I've been guilty of it myself, candidly, in the past. So business cases are really important, okay? But it's the quality, not the width. So it's not the weight of the business case in paper, it's actually what it's talking about. So I've seen, as I say, hands up, I think I've been guilty of this in myself in the past. Actually, you may be thinking you're talking the right behaviours in terms of trying to help the organisation, take positive steps in terms of being more commercial. But actually, some of the financial control systems you put in place maybe inhibit it, and they inhibit it because actually it's kind of so risk averse in terms of fill out this really complicated questionnaire and have all this. That actually it kind of ends up, inhibiting that impulse. And actually the risk there, of course, is that the organisation then begin to bypass you.
Yeah.
Which I absolutely don't want to happen. So I just want to reassure you, Brendan, I'm not talking about burning business cases, but I am talking about actually less is more, and the less to be really focusing on around a business case is actually understanding the risk, quantifying it as best as possible, being clear about whether it's been tried before and what the points of kind of comparison are, and being clear about what the investment is and what you hope for the return on that investment in a way that people can understand and debate.
Yeah. I think the other thing that comes out of this is we were talking before about knowing what the risk is and knowing what you don't know. Of course, to extend that to the famous Donald Rumsfeld quote, then you go into how do you know what you don't know? You don't know what you don't know. And that's about behaviours as well, about opening up different perspectives. So you kind of have to open up the debate and discussion about what risk is and what constitutes risk. It's not just simple financial risk, it's other things that have implications.
Correct, and now that includes reputational risk. Funny enough, it also includes kind of capacity risk. It sounds a strange thing to say, but you can be comfortable, you think you understand the risk, but actually underplay the amount of support you may need to put in place to make it land safely.
And I think the other point to make is that in all discussions about risk is that we can never, of course, be certain by definition. So it is behoving on the financial community and organisation to clarify to people you cannot be accurate to the nth degree about the potential risk because a lot of it is unknown.
That's true. That's true. A lot of it's about language as well, and I think particularly around thinking and behaviours. And if I repeat to colleagues listening in, so this is these aren't rogue agendas anymore. See, these are actually now mainstream impulses. The idea of responding to austerity and place shaping. But that doesn't mean kind of all common sense goes out the window. It doesn't mean it's not been done before by lots of people. It has, but the scale, the intensity, the exposure now is much wider.
Yeah.
And as well as being seen, genuinely leaning in and helping the organisation, promote these agendas, particularly about commercial risk. It still behoves, this back to my mantra, forgive me. It still behoves the fact, actually, the more commercial you are, the more savvy the due diligence needs to be, not less.
And that spills into as well the other bullet points in this slide, I suppose, is about governance arrangements have to be appropriate.
Yeah.
So we have to, again, in your words, understand what it is you're trying to achieve here. And similarly, for the operating models that you're going to construct for your commercial enterprises or commercial activities, because they might not be commercial enterprises, you have to be very clear about those as well, and what you're trying to do, making sure they're appropriate for what you're trying to do. So therefore, you really need to know what you're trying to do all the time. It comes back to that all the time.
It does, and I'm sure we'll delve into that a bit more detail. But just on the governance point, what you want to hope and influence is in place is actually there's a transparent, well-informed process for making the decision as to why you do something. And then there's also a transparent, I don't mean it doesn't need to be public, but I mean transparent in terms of the right people are involved and the right advice is on the table, and eyes wide open advice. And so not only do you want that confidence that the organisation is taking decisions eyes wide open, so to speak, you then want confidence that it's put in place, a way of delivering what it thinks it's going to do in a way that gives confidence. Now, that doesn't automatically mean setting up a company, but it does mean actually some thought has gone into, well, which group of people are going to do this? Is it the right capacity? What's the support they need? I know it sounds obvious. People are doing it well, but I come back to a point I made earlier, which colleagues on the call think seem to be playing back to us as well, really, that for once we're afraid this is an uneven skills creation. Now, the final point in that slide, Brendan, if you allow me just to, what's being more savvy and what's being more, what's it really mean? It's partly behaviours, but it's partly about capacity. The behaviours bit of this is actually, finance, senior finance colleagues, senior finance practitioners. You're not operating in a vacuum. You're not operating in isolation. So really important, and blindingly obvious, so forgive me, but really important how you work with and create those good networks with legal officer colleagues, with the procurement colleagues, so that you are kind of broadening the skill set, broadening the ownership of the delivery. But the other thing I would also say, and this, I see this a lot, and it's not a criticism, but actually, inevitably, if you're into some of this newer commercial risk area, it's about augmenting your capacity. It isn't just about communicating internally and working better internally. It's about augmenting your capacity. It's inevitable. In fact, I'd be amazed if that didn't, some of if these commercial ventures that involve taking on commercial risk did not require augmenting your capacity.
And what do you mean by that?
So I mean, at the very minimum, some external advice. But often you may want to think about, well, actually, and I say this, I suppose, talking to the CFO or senior finance person. Actually, if it's a program, to do with property, and establishing a commercial property portfolio, well, you've really got to think about that's not just about some advice about setting it up. What's your capacity around the kind of project finance management of that? That's additional capacity, and that, in many ways, needs to be thought about at the outset, so that the whole organisation is aware that's the cost of the investment as well.
The temptation to try and do some of these things with your existing teams and the teams you've used to do changes in the past, perhaps, and sometimes you're going to find that either you're stretching that capacity or they just simply don't have the experience and necessary skills.
Correct.
So let's move on. If we've set the tactics, we've set the context, we've set the definition of what we're talking about, what we're going to do is that the remaining time is think about, okay, So what's the tips and tactics? This is very much of a sort of okay challenge to people like Sean, saying, okay, if you were now taking over the job on the first day and someone said, right, you need to be more commercial, what's the sort of set of lists that you would put down and say, what were your top tips for that person?
Okay, well, thank you, Brendan. So when you asked me to reflect on this, that's exactly what I had in mind, which is, if I was a new treasurer or a new senior person with this kind of agenda in my responsibility, what's the bit of paper I would have wanted my predecessor to have left for me with the top tips? And I hasten to add that this will be, I'm sure, well known to everyone, but these would be my top tips. So forgive me. The first one is just, what? It's such an important mindset to have in mind that the more commercial it is, the more savvy the due diligence needs to be, and we've expanded on that. But you know what? Top tips, risk of repetition, but they serve repetition. Fill the skill and knowledge gap. That means be honest about what you don't know. Put the specific governance in place. Now, you're part of an organisation, but actually, it's not about the I word. This is about the we word. Surely we organisation want to get this right. So that's really quite important. Know your risk boundary. Now, this is not aimed at the CFO, but it's actually aimed at the organisation.
Yeah.
And this really plays into the importance of communicating and the importance of engaging as best you can with your, if you're CFO itself, your management team, colleagues, or if you're senior practitioner, but senior ranks in the organisation. But engaging in getting a sense of what everyone feels they mean by commercial risk, and what they're prepared to do, and just make sure you do your best to make sure there's an alignment there. And that's one of my top tips. I wish someone had told me at the time.
And that's interesting that you should use that one, because of course, I mean, clearly it's a very important one, and it's something that's not understood by people, because you say to people, well, this is a risk boundary, and again, it's a definition thing. You really have to make sure that people can see in what they are doing where the risk is arising. So it's making sure that happens, that it's at a tactical level, if you like, or the level of the officer doing the work. They need to see what that risk boundary means in real life.
And the good device around that is actually looking at the opposite of the good idea. So in other words, what could happen if it went wrong?
Yeah.
And that just gives you a way into.
Yes.
But that, as I say, these are about, in a sense, personal leadership, I suppose, and top tips. The other one, which is really difficult for CFOs, but it's around, and senior finance stuff, but it's around optimism bias. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, particularly in the context we're talking about, where more and more people are doing more and more of this, then what you're going to get, and what is happening, we know it's happening, is your colleague who's done it elsewhere, they seem to have done it in place, so you feel you can just, there's a risk, you can just lift and shift and drop. Invariably you can't, right? That may give you a good template, but you don't know what the context of that particular local authority is, what the culture is, what its own risk boundary is. So actually, optimism bias in the sense of it work there, must work here is a risk. The other optimism bias is very challenging for finance colleagues, is when others in the organisation, your chief executive, your leader, they bumped into colleague X, colleague Y, they come back saying they're doing this, let's do it. And that in a sense is challenging. And it's challenging in two ways. It suffers potentially from, but it may look like it works elsewhere, but what's the guarantee it will work? But the other bit that is a real problem, really important, I think, risk to keep in mind, this is top tips I wish people had told me kind of thing a long time ago, but the optimism bias extends to, this stuff is linked to your medium-term financial balance, okay, back to one of the key drivers. So actually, people are doing this because it offsets some other. So the optimism bias is that you bake in return too soon. Right. So actually, you think you can deliver that yield or whatever it is you're looking for in year one, where actually, if you thought about it, it's year two. But the problem, but having baked it in, it being part of your medium-term financial plan, for the following year, rather than maybe it should have been the year after, you become under a lot of pressure to deliver a number, which puts relationships at risk, and why you're being some risk averse Sean or whatever the person is. But actually, it's a function of optimism bias.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we should raise optimism bias as one of the things we should be focusing on, because it is such a mixture of things. It's not just simply that sort of human thing of being over-optimistic, but it's making errors in terms of, we know when we plan to do these things in the past, they've never taken the time we thought, or they've never cost the amount, and yet we always forget that. Similarly, there's this problem about sunk costs. We spend so much money on the feasibility study. We must go ahead, or we've already poured money into the country park or whatever. We need to keep it open. Just going on to that, sort of in terms of examples about were between risk. I suppose it's between risk and optimism bias. Where people have made decisions in the past, we've seen authorities, we've seen organisations making decisions about property in the past, or buying assets in the past that have gone wrong. That's because they didn't know their risk boundary, do you think, or what do we learn from that about risk?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I think candidly, in this bit of commercialisation, which is around taking on more commercial risk, by definition, more things will go wrong. Okay, so things are going to go wrong. The trick will be, how aware are you, and what have you done to try and minimise that? Now, if you are talking commercial property, and I have the good fortune to manage pension funds in the county council setting, and they have lots of property investments, pension funds. And it's interesting to see the amount of due diligence would go into purchasing properties, but also the tactics they would employ, and they're obvious, aren't they? Which is around, the old adage, not having too many eggs in one basket, so they would diversify. So things like that to manage the commercial risk. And of course, you inevitably find yourself saying, well, if a pension fund, which actually in a funny kind of way is paid to take risk, is actually putting this kind of due diligence around what they do, then maybe we should be doing the same when we're doing it for our own books. Within the local authority. So Brendan, candidly, if you're taking on more commercial risk, it means things will go wrong. Okay. So speaking personally, Sean Nolan, Director of Local Government, CIFRA and Policing, if I think people have done all they can from kind of savvy due diligence, they're going to have my support. But we're not going to stand by everyone who, if they haven't gone through all those processes, then they're leaving themselves exposed. So there's a degree of self-interest here as well in this new agenda.
And it's thinking about how we address that. There are actually, strangely, very simple ways. One of it actually is to do what we're doing at the moment, which is talking about it, and talking about it in organisations and communicating about what assumptions are behind your risk assessment, what assumptions, if you like, behind your why they're so optimistic. And it just occurred to me, of course, what we perhaps ought to put behind the word optimism bias is perhaps in brackets pessimism bias as well, which is the sort of thing we're all accused of.
Well, actually, look, Brandon, that's really important, and we talked a little bit earlier about thinking and behaviours, and I feel this feels very important agenda for us as senior finance people. We've got to be seen to be relevant in the organisation, and I repeat to everyone, it's quite legitimate for the two driving reasons I talked about earlier, response to austerity, self-sufficiency, avoiding otherwise more difficult cuts, and the place shaping. It's actually quite legitimate to be more commercial, right? And actually we've got to be seen to be more legitimate. So the biggest part of the biggest risk for senior finance staff, and it's not a general risk, but the potential biggest risk, is actually your pessimism. That people think, well, Brendan would say that, or Sean would say that. Well, actually, that's really important around your style and how you're seen to be engaging. And if you like, the more you engage, the more freedom you'll get to talk about the real risks that you want the organisation to be aware of. There are two other top tips. You know, this is the letter I wish somebody had written me when I first became a treasurer, so to speak. Form follows function. What I mean by that is the right first question is not what's the right trading company. The right first question is what am I trying to achieve? Okay. So actually, you know, Brendan, I speak to some of the senior partners at some of the firms, legal firms, and they kind of, in the margin say to me, actually, they are still looking at the people who jump straight to, what colour trading company can I have, rather than what that I'm trying to achieve. And that's really important because what you're trying to achieve, particularly around, and I'm going to say more commercial, taking on more commercial risk, but the real reason for that is you're wanting to bring in more income. So you're, typically, if it's property, you're talking about yield. Well, that may lend itself to automatically the right answer as a trading company, but sometimes not. So it's not always, so form follows function is be really clear what you're trying to achieve, and then be clear about the vehicle you're going to use. And the vehicle doesn't need to be external, it could be pulling together a team internally.
Absolutely.
They're going to do it. Yeah. And the final thing is look, prudential code. Okay, I work for SIFA now, but for most of my career I've been in local government and policing. The prudential code is one of the best things that SIFA were able, if you like, to negotiate on behalf of local government with central government. And as we know, the prudential code is a permission for a local authority to borrow, to invest what it thinks it needs, subject to it feeling it's affordable, and it feeling it knows the risk, and it feeling it's got a way of managing those risks. The prudential code isn't a series of indicators, right? Now, funnily enough, those top tips I've described to you, actually, I'd argue they're in the prudential code.
Yeah.
And it's really important, I think, in a sense, to give quite a lot of profile within the organisation as to the prudential code, and I mean the principles under the code. Do I know the risk? How do I manage it? Rather than just completing indicators once a year, because that will help. So to colleagues, that will help your conversation internally with members, because this isn't just you being pessimistic. This is about actually we get this ability to do this. Actually, I have to say to you, unrivaled anywhere else in the public sector. Okay, so it's really important that that we cherish this, but actually comes with certain responsibilities.
Yeah, and that leads us actually into some of the tactics. What we've listed here, the kind of tactics, the kind of areas of behaviours, the kind of things that we can do. And we're not going to go through all of them, but we'll just pick out a couple of ones that I'm interested in. One, I do a lot of work around business partnering, for instance, and of course one of the things people always go on about is early engagement in the business case, saying we can never get early engagement. So what are the tactics that get you the early engagement in business cases around commercials?
Well, look, this is reflecting sometimes what I didn't get right in the past as well as what I did get right. But early engagement in business cases actually comes from organisation or key other colleagues thinking you're interested in their agenda, right, rather than you're there as a hurdle to be overcome. Because if you're a hurdle, like any hurdle, people take their time before they jump the hurdle. So you want to be part of the strategy, the formulation at the front end. And I know it sounds easier to say than do, but in my experience, as I say, got it right sometimes, not so right other times. What I would say in terms of getting it right is actually you have to be really proactive and really want to understand what the organisation is about. If you're the Chief Finance Officer, these conversations, because of the two drags I've talked about earlier, are very real conversations. Actually, as Paige pointed out earlier, a lot of this has been happening for a long time. But actually, it's taking on different shapes. So if it's happening in departments, actually, you want to proactively go out of your way to be kind of literally getting close to some of those colleagues and asking, how can you help? What's getting in the way? So that you make yourself part of the solution. And then hopefully, that gives you the ability to be more involved at the front end. So it doesn't always work, despite everything I've just said. and you know, in a sense, you have to hold your courage and still insist on not a kind of difficult obstacle called a business case, but actually the discipline of thinking through the answers. But early engagement through actually early investment, I suppose, in people's agendas is crucial.
And what was the saying really is think of it from the point of view of the person using it, how easy it is for them to engage with you. If we make it difficult to engage, then it's not surprising that people will not engage. And as you said earlier on, the great risk is they'll go out and they'll go around the system. So how easy is the system? How much does the system facilitate them achieving their aims, as well as the aims of finance and the aims of the prudential code, for instance? So that's what one point we've got there. Another one there is the one in inverted commas, quantifying the risk of failure, not just the joy of success. What does that mean?
So this plays back into our earlier conversation around understanding the risk boundary, and we're particularly talking here about taking on commercial risk because you're trying to up your commercial returns. Well, you know, the danger is, and this isn't optimism bias, the danger is clearly the focus is on the opportunity it creates.
Yeah.
But actually it's really important that you're talking to the organisation and helping them understand, well, what's the risk of it going wrong?
Yeah.
You know, can you quantify it? And that's sort of tactically you need to do that.
Excellent. And I just want to bring up just one more example before we move on to this one. The seeking external successful examples. What does that look like?
That's really important, actually. So for senior finance colleagues, and so we may touch on this later, Brendan, because I think SIFS has got a role to play here as well in terms of, you know, being a bit of a repository for this kind of work. But actually, what you want to do is you want to avoid, or you want to try and avoid, you know, being too insular. So actually reach out to your networks. Your networks could be your society net, you know, your treasurer society networks. It could be local councils. But actually, you know, it really helps your kind of sense of a contribution to this in terms of looking at what others do and if they've done it. Now, but the key caveat here is we talked about earlier, actually it's really good to find successful examples elsewhere because it gives you a template, right? But it's not necessarily an ideal match. You have to actually test whether the things that make it work in, you know, your colleague's area actually will still hold true in your area. But it's really important.
Okay. Well, let's now look at some. There's a list here of sort of typical examples that we know that authorities are increasingly looking to. And one of the things that I think, rather than going through these in great detail, one interesting question is where are the hidden risks? If you look at those, which of those bullet points suggest to us areas where there's a risk that you wouldn't necessarily know when you first look at them? What sort of areas?
Well, that's really interesting. So I think what I find myself reflecting on a lot is that first bullet point, funny enough, Brendan, because if I mentioned earlier, part of the driver is partly austerity, but it's also linked to that is this self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
And what's absolutely at the heart of the business rate retention agenda, whether it's the current 50% or actually the more dramatic 100% retention planned in a few years' time, currently planned anyway, what's at the heart of that is an actual economic development bet. And it's interesting because what basically is underpinning that agenda partly is we want, this is government talking, we want to incentivise you to grow your local economies and you get to keep your returns. In the small print, what that means typically is actually investing, whether it's a new roundabout or a new bypass, something that opens up, or, you know, there can be softer investments around, you know, investing in skills, but I'm particularly thinking infrastructure investment that opens up, you hope for, business rates. Well, actually, that infrastructure investment, whether it's a roundabout, a new road, something that opens up a business park, actually that could be big money, right? And you're hoping that the business rate comes in, and that business rate more than covers the borrowing, because because that's the other key bit that always has to be borne in mind. Well, what's the investment? This is a business case point. So that is, in a funny kind of way, when I hear people talk about commercial, when I hear people talk about commercial risk, when you hear some commentators say, well, should local government be doing this? They often refer to the other examples on that slide, and they don't refer to this bit about economic development. But actually, economic development is a commercial bet. So that's, in a sense, actually, if you talk about thinking and behaviours, I've spoken to one or two professional colleagues recently, and that's actually something that's really important to, for them to feel involved in. And it's not any of these kind of newer models. It's something that's going on all the time and increasingly so. The second bullet point there is an interesting one, because that's what I guess we're seeing more and more of. The commercial property yield, where actually people are buying properties for yield. They're not buying it for other policy reasons. They're buying it to generate income to help offset. And that's something where I talk about uneven skills gradient, but that's, I guess, if I was picking an example where in a sense there's least historical exposure to that, it would be that example.
And that's the sort of, I think we talked before about sort of jagged risk profile. It's not clear, it's not smooth, it's not as predictable as some of the other
correct. Well, the thing about property, and particularly commercial property and buying yield, is these things can go up and down, and all the stuff that is kind of heavily kind of managed, I suppose, in a pension fund setting. Those risks are real.
So I suppose what we're saying is that there's lots of examples. You have to be very careful to know that each of those will have their kind of unique risk profiles.
Correct.
And it's being aware of them, and where you might have an example where 2 or 3 of those bullet points are all put together in one scheme, and they will have different risk profiles, and you have to think through what those are. What I want to do now is let's see if we can start to bring this together, draw together some conclusions. So in the next few minutes we have. Conclusion 1, think about those top tips. Now those are your top tips, Sean. Obviously we want people to think about those, take those, internalise them, maybe add some of their own to them. What about that last, the second bullet point rather, widen our net when thinking about risk? Is that
well, look, I kind of reflect to myself and reflect to everyone listening that if you think about taking on commercial risk and it is new, then you've really got to think about and communicate and engage with the organisation about the nature of that risk, and it may be different from any of your established learning up to that point. Again, we know lots of councils, lots of colleagues will be well used to this, but in that kind of uneven gradient bit, it's widen your net when thinking about risk. That means actually, what's the downside risk? What could go wrong? How do you manage that? Is the organisation comfortable with that? Do you need particularly new skills to think about it? That takes you into the place of thinking, well, who else? Which of my colleagues have done something like this? I shall go and talk to them. How did they manage risk? It's just about, in a sense, I'm sure everyone's outward thinking anyway and outward looking, but it is really about putting a premium on thinking, outside your kind of normal experiences.
And our third bullet point there, needing to know what you want commercialism to deliver and need to relentlessly communicate. I'm very keen on that. It's making sure you know exactly what it is you're trying to achieve here, and making sure it's properly communicated and it's not distorted, so that it encourages the right behaviour. So it's very straightforward, but we're under no illusions about how difficult that is to achieve. And in terms of SIPFA support to CFOs, Sean?
Yeah, no, thanks, Brendan. So I think particularly for my role in SIPFA, in support of Rob and others, really keen to recognise that CFOs and senior finance staff are a really important constituency. And the world isn't black and white; it's actually very grey, and actually we need to be supporting them. And part of the support we can do, and in fact this is starting today, isn't it? But part of the support we can do and will do is actually what's the kind of dedicated training and development programs around this agenda we as CIFA, we're well placed to do this. You know, we haven't got a particular axe or edge, but what can we do to support CFOs in that regard and senior staff? And indeed, you know, that'll be a package of support. And indeed, we're already, I think, as you're aware, in not too distant future, we'll be launching a grandly titled kind of mini MBA.
Yeah, and that's going to be aimed at the finance practitioners.
Yeah.
To look at the some of the questions that we've just been discussing and thinking about how you can position yourself to support commercialisation, as well as what we're really focusing on today, I suppose, which is the CFO level.
Well, that's a relatively senior level, yes.
Yeah. So I hope that you, our colleagues listening to this, have found this a useful conversation. Please contact, it says there, with any questions or how to take this forward. You can also, of course, contact Sean or myself. So sean.nolan@civil.org or brendan.mccarron@civil.org, and we'd be very happy to chat this through with you and see where where our thinking is going. And also, we're really always interested in people helping us to think about what they're doing and to look for examples and case studies and articles. We're always interested in promulgating those to our networks and webinars like this. So I suppose finally, if we're going to ask, are there any questions that in these last 5 minutes or so, and see if anyone's got any particular questions, and if not, we'll be through by the next couple of minutes. So we'll just hold on and see if you've got any any questions. I haven't seen any coming through, but maybe it's because I'm looking in the wrong place, actually. Ah, here we are. Should there be some audio yet? That was a techie question. There we are. So I'm guessing wildly, unless someone is desperately typing away, I think that's it. So thank you very much for listening. As I say, I hope you found that useful, and please do be in contact and keep an eye out for some of the products we were just talking about, but also help us to feeding through to us any thoughts that you have. And we are just cutting this out now.